Hi, my name's Felicity Boardman. I'm a professor of social science and medicine at the University of Warwick. Most of the research that I do focuses on the perspectives of people with genetic conditions and their attitudes towards reproductive and genetic technologies. And I'm here today to talk about some of those interviews that I've done with families and to help you to think about how that might feed into some of the social and ethical debates around human developmental biology. So I'm here to give you a bit of a taster of some of the perspectives of people living with genetic conditions and how we can incorporate them into the way that we think about human developmental biology. And the research that I'm going to be showing you today is an interview study with parents who had a child, and children were varying ages, who had a diagnosis of Down syndrome. And Down syndrome is a condition, as many of you will be aware, that is sometimes called trisomy 21. It's caused by a repeat of the chromosome 21. So rather than having two copies of chromosome 21, people with Down syndrome have three. It's a condition that usually happens by chance at conception, and it's typically associated with some degree of learning disability, certain physical characteristics, and it also has implications for health. And I wanted to show you data from this interview study because the research in the field of early developmental biology has implications for how Down syndrome is understood. And I interviewed 25 parents, the majority of whom were mothers who had children with Down syndrome, ranging from 18 months old all the way up to adulthood. And I also later interviewed adults with Down syndrome themselves, although it's the parent data I wanted to show you today. The parents were being interviewed about their views on antenatal screening for Down syndrome, but they were also being asked about how they viewed the possibility of cure. And their insights are really relevant to some of the debates that you'll be having because they highlight that we need to think very carefully about how we understand and differentiate between health, disease, disability, and identity when we talk about conditions like Down syndrome. These were typically viewed as very distinct concepts in the parents' answers, and they have very different implications for daily living. So, moving straight into the data, I first wanted to show you an excerpt from an interview with a lady called Carly. She was 34 years old at the time of her interview, and her daughter Amaya had Down syndrome, and she was 6 years old at the time. And during the course of the interview, Carly was very clear that she saw health and illness as very different to disability. She said, I think there's a big difference between doing research that could lead to new treatments or cure for some of the medical issues, like the heart issues, the Alzheimer's, the higher risk of leukemia that people with Down syndrome have. Those sorts of things that could improve the quality and length of their life. But where I draw the line is stopping these kids being born in the first place, of correcting everything. I can't imagine a world where we stop allowing these kids and all that they offer into society. They're not miserable, they're not suffering, you know. I think Amaya has a better life than I do. And once you start on that path, where does it end up? Do we correct left-handers because the world is set up for right-handers and it becomes easier to do that than to change the world? I want to live in a world where everyone is welcome, regardless of their chromosome numbers. Some things don't need fixing because they're not broken. So Carly's view on wanting only to intervene in the health aspects of Down syndrome was one that was quite widespread amongst the parents that I interviewed. Carly saw these health issues as not being part of Amaya's disability and identity, but instead as issues that affected her quality and her length of life. And if we move on to the next slide, we can see this with Shirley's view as well. So Shirley was 69 at the time of her interview, and she was living with her 40-year-old son, Tom, who was diagnosed with Down syndrome a week after his birth. And she said, my general view of screening is that if we screen for Down syndrome, that as a society, we're saying that's something that's not acceptable, which obviously I don't believe. We screen for cancers, don't we? Because they're terrible things and we don't want them. And I don't understand why we apply that same principle to Down syndrome. And I think we have to think long and hard about why we band Down syndrome together with awful things like cancer and try to prevent it. Sure, there are hard bits that come along with Down syndrome, and dementia is something that still scares me. But most things about Down syndrome, like the way Tom looks, the way he talks, his personality, that's just who Tom is. And, we love him for that. I often wonder, is it only because we've got the technology to do it and Down syndrome is an easy target? You really have to look at each condition individually and all the aspects of that condition and not be led by the technology and what it can do. Because we might start getting rid of things that, in the grand scheme of things, weren't actually a big problem to begin with. So for Shirley, this kind of drive to prevent or cure Down syndrome didn't make sense to her. With her view of Down syndrome, but seeing it as just part of who Tom was, how he looks, how he speaks, his personality. And this insight brings us to the question of, what is it about a condition that makes it part of someone's identity? Why does Shirley feel this way about Down syndrome? Yet research to cure or prevent cancer is not viewed as devaluing people with cancer. And these are issues that are really important to understand if we want to explore some of the social and ethical consequences of early developmental biology. Shirley makes sense of it all by suggesting that there might be a technological imperative. That is, because the technology now exists to do the research into and prevent Down syndrome, that is what is driving work in this area. And she warns against following the technology. And instead, she's calling for a careful consideration of each condition so that it could be delivered in an appropriate way that aligns with societal values. And finally, I wanted to show you a quote from Aleph. Aleph was 45 at the time of his interview and had a 6-year-old son, Harvey. Aleph was very clear about which parts of Down syndrome were problematic for their daily lives, and that they had very little to do with biology. He said, on a day-to-day basis, the biggest problems we have are other people's attitudes and getting the right support for Harvey, actually. And neither of those things are down to the Down syndrome per se. They're about other people not having enough education and ignorance, really. I think when you have a kid and it's visible, people recognize the facial features, and straight away, all these assumptions are made. People underestimate him and treat him like he's a bit simple, he's a bit slow, when he's actually very capable. There's such a wide range of abilities, and that's the hard bit. That's the struggle, how other people respond to it, and also having to fight for things that should already be there. That's the problem of living with Down syndrome, not Down syndrome itself. So Aleph is highlighting here that it's the social aspects of Down syndrome. So the way that Harvey is responded to, the way his needs are accommodated within society, these are the major sources of stress and upset in their daily lives, rather than the biological or clinical aspects of Down syndrome. And I think this point is a really interesting one to bear in mind, because Aleph and amongst many other parents were arguing that actually what needs to be changed here is society rather than the biology of individuals. And just to finish with some concluding thoughts, I think it's really important that we consider the full range of factors that influences someone's experience with a condition. So these include the social and the biological. We are inherently social beings, so our biology is always experienced through that social lens, as well as we need to think about factors such as the built environment, our interactions with people in daily lives. All these factors contribute to how that condition is actually experienced in the real world. Ultimately, what is considered disability in one society may not be in another. So we need to take account of that social lens, that social layering that comes on top of a disability and leads to the experience that someone ultimately has with their condition. And I think one important way that these views of people with genetic conditions can contribute to some of the debates that you'll be having about the social and ethical impacts of developmental biology is to take seriously their views and their accounts of their conditions. These are people who live intimately with these conditions every day of their lives. And their views on which aspects of the condition they experience as particularly difficult and which are which they think are okay, are really important. And importantly, they are different often to what a biologist or a clinician might look at or think is important. So I would say to take away from this presentation is the idea that we need to think very carefully actually about the people who end up with the conditions that you'll be considering.